Hello everybody, welcome to the Wonky Angle, where I talk about electronic music, both new and old. And today, I'm talking about the new album from Reid Willis, Reliquary. I feel like it's finally about time I talk about Reid Willis in a proper dedicated video. This underground artist based in New Orleans has impressed the hell out of me twice through his releases on the Mesh label, first with Mother Of in 2020, which I did get to a bit late and didn't hear until early 2021, and then, of course, with Sediment in 2023, which I did get to in time to actually let it sit, and watch as it climbed all the way up to taking the #1 spot for my year-end list that year. This guy's been putting out some next-level shit for a minute now, making super dense experimental IDM mixes combined with modern classical and orchestral influences. But I've only been talking about him through some stuff I missed segments before now, and especially after how much that last album stuck with me, I feel like he is well overdue a full video discussing a new project of his more actually in depth. God knows his stuff has had more than enough substance for full videos. I mean, Sediment, frankly, only didn't get a full video because I got lazy. And also, sort of because I thought shouting him out into some stuff I missed roundup might possibly get more eyes on him, which I don't know how much of a difference that actually made. But I also wanted to do this video in order to point out that this guy's been putting out work in this vein for way longer than just 2020. His catalog actually goes all the way back to the late 2000s, and this latest album here is his 10th studio album to date by my count. I wanted to go back and check out his other stuff just for my own curiosity. And minor spoilers, all of his albums are really good, including the super early stuff, so it turned out to be the kind of thing that might be well served through highlighting in a fuller in brief segment. For the record, his first 5 albums are not on Bandcamp. Only his most recent 5 from Crude Healing onwards are there as of recording this, but the rest can easily be found on all the other major streaming services, including YouTube and Spotify and Apple Music, and they're obviously currently purchasable on iTunes. So yeah, I went back and listened to all his previous albums, and here's my thoughts on his discography so far. So, let's start all the way at the beginning of his story with his debut here from 2007, and even though the production values here are unsurprisingly noticeably lower, and everything's being assembled out of relatively obvious, if still pretty nice sounding MIDI instrumentation and stock samples, you can still pretty immediately see the through line to how this guy would go on to make stuff like Mother Of and Sediment. This album is less serious in tone than the stuff he's become more known for lately. There's a lot of banging break beats, influences from dubstep, drum and bass, and even instrumental hip-hop via all the DJ scratching. But the way these influences are still combined with lots of well-textured classical and jazz-inspired arrangements creates this sort of whimsical old 2000s PC fantasy game soundtracky type of experience that I quite enjoyed. For a complete unknown artist self-releasing his debut album with absolutely no backing, it is pretty dang solid and shows a lot of the promising talent for instrumental arrangement he had right out of the gate. I mean, if a no-name artist had sent an album of this caliber into me through a $10 Patreon request today, I would have immediately felt like, oh, this is proper video material instead of doing my usual text post. So, yeah, needless to say, this was a strong start. And this is pretty much just the exact same album as his debut again, but I guess even more breakbeat heavy this time. Some parts of this even sort of start to border on like Big Beat in an early Chemical Brothers adjacent vein. I think I like the debut a tiny bit more, but this is about on par with it. More stuff like the last 2 albums, but I guess this one has some more, like, world music instrumentation and stuff, and tries to get a little more expansive in scale. It's about as fascinating a listen as the first 2, maybe a tiny bit on the longish side, but far from bothersome in that way. Getting some Floix Machinarium soundtrack type energy out of many parts of this. Okay, now you can really start to hear more of the Reid Willis style we've come to recognize nowadays. This shows him narrowing his focus into a darker and mildly modern classical inspired IDM record with a lot of glitches and kalimbas and stuff. Feels a little Rumpistol Dynamo-ish in many parts. There was one track with vocals, too, presumably from Willis himself, and it's clearly the same guy singing there as on Shoulder the Burden 13 years later. Enjoyment-wise, this is on roughly the same level as his other stuff up to this point, but you can certainly see his craft progressively improving and getting higher detail. Like the last album, but even better developed, fusing the glitchier IDM elements, modern classical pianos, and mild orchestral elements in a much more seamless fashion. This is the first point at which the chord Reid Willis style you know today feels fully realized and nailed down. And it's one of his best albums overall, certainly his best project up to this point. Great stuff. This is the earliest album of his that you can buy on Bandcamp as of recording this. It's more stuff in the vein of The Sunken Half, but with a slight bit more variety in sound, with a couple of tracks that lean away from classical elements or tracks that bring back in some vocals. Also, it's smaller scale and less cohesive feeling. I think The Sunken Half was better, but this obviously is not far behind. And this one, I guess, is kind of a mix of other ideas from his last two albums. At this point, he'd pretty much set down his formula and firmly stuck to it from here on out. I might need to let some of these sit with me longer so that I'd be able to pin down my thoughts better. This one does run together more than some of his others around this era. Though I will say the more delicate ambient moments on this one hit for me a lot better than the more up-tempo moments, which explore some percussive mixes that I feel he would directly improve upon by his next two albums. Alright, it was obviously at this point he finally got picked up by Max Cooper to join the Mesh label. What with this being something of a breakthrough album for him, bringing his work to a slightly wider audience, he really went out of his way to try and make this album even more dense and lush and extravagant than anything else he made previously. Possibly even to a slight fault, since a lot of these tracks were so dense on ideas that some could maybe lose sight of their structure sometimes, and the pacing as a complete whole wasn't always the best. But it was still a pretty mind-expanding experience all the same, with lots of phenomenal moments that have stuck with me long term. You can tell that this one meant something special to him, and it does still stand as one of his best. But of course, here we arrive at what I feel to be his best album to date. Obviously, I have a bit of bias towards this one, what with my having listened to it dozens more times than any of the others. And looking back on it in the fuller context of his catalog, there isn't anything here sonically that he hadn't already been doing on plenty of other albums before this one. A lot of tracks here do sound very similar to other tracks on old albums like The Sunken Half, Crude Healing, and The Longing Device. But I still feel like this one managed to really refine those ideas he'd explored previously through this comparatively more direct approach, and structure and sequence each of those ideas so that all of these tracks would really allow the core tunes underneath to shine, making sure each track could hit its core emotion and stand on its own as a song first, and letting the impressiveness of the sound design speak for itself second. I scored it an 8.5 when I covered it, but it is an easy 9 out of 10 for me now. So that finally brings us to here. Yeah, this guy's whole catalog is really good. All of these albums were enjoyable in their own ways and are all worth hearing. He definitely has a certain formula he's stuck to, and a lot of these albums do sound pretty dang similar to each other, especially from The Sunken Half onwards. But A, it's a formula that's clearly worked for him and is still exciting to hear each time, and B, it was cool to see him gradually develop it and iterate upon it over the years. I think I might be able to keep all of these around. Going into a new album of his, I had a pretty good idea on what to expect. And for the record, I had already heard this album a couple of times before I went through the rest of his back catalog. He personally emailed me a SoundCloud link to the full album in advance of its release. Reliquary is an album that sticks to pretty much the exact kinds of sounds you would already expect out of him. A lot of dense IDM sound design and movie soundtrack-ready orchestral arrangements and stuff that feel very grand and sweeping, but also easy to emotionally connect with. If you've heard Mother of and Sediment, then you've already heard like 90% of the sounds he'll explore on this album as well. Although, as usual, he does also find a new way to structure and present these ideas that allows this to not be made completely redundant by other earlier works of his. In particular, this album is notable for having one of his marginally shorter track listings, just 10 tracks, where a lot of his previous ones would frequently add up to like 12 or 13. But you're more likely to run into the kinds of more complex, epic sort of tracks that have quite a lot of ideas going into them over tracks that maybe feel more single-minded in their identity. Which could also theoretically be a recipe for a track listing that runs together, and it kinda does. Not every single track here hits for me on an equal level, and some did fall in the background for me on many listens. but I do still feel like it's one of his more well-structured efforts, with each of the tracks pinning down their own identities in context, on top of segueing into each other quite effectively. The album starts out strong in the opener Mutual Fawn. At first we're treating to a voice saying, "Welcome," and a single synth pad that sounds like Willis's rendition of Ready, Let's Go by Boards of Canada. Though lots of strings build up around it to set up the usual grand and epic vibe, the mix dies down into some choppy arpeggios. Lots of grand string sections build up around those and create a sense of vast and hopeful openness. And then everything cuts out to make way for a buzzing bass line and some intense tribal percussion for a whole darker section that builds up and gets more intense in the same way. There's also an entire ambient section following that where the string pads get a whole almost 2-minute stretch to swirl around and change shape and texture and tone before the arpeggios from near the beginning reprise one last time. While all the elements going into these mixes sound very familiar to plenty of other work he's put out before, and there's not exactly the strongest of melodic hooks to really let it go the extra mile and tie everything together, there is a lot going on in those 6.5 minutes. Yeah, this track is only 6.5 minutes. And it really keeps you guessing where things might be going next. And it does effectively set the tone for the rest of the album and really let you know what you're getting into. It's a sort of overture kind of piece for the whole album, I guess. The next track, Diamond Spitter, cranks up the energy level and tempo a bit more, although the entire first minute of the track is pretty much entirely made out of various textures of rumbling and pulsating bass, before there's a few bars of chopped up knocking and tapping sound effects, and the beats finally start to come in with a little hint of a burial-esque bounce. The percussion on this track feels very tactile and mechanical, as well, as if everything's being cut together out of recordings of him messing around with household objects and stuff. Not a new development, but still cool. There's bits where choir pads come in to make the whole mix feel more expansive, but there's other bits focused more on the bass and percussion, and a loosely odd and experimental kind of vibe. And I think my favorite part of the track is right near the end, around the 5-minute mark, where some strings come in with this vaguely Asian-inspired melody that I quite like. Next track is The Gnawing, and as you might guess from that title, this track is a lot more focused around slower tempos and a ton of building tension out of comparatively negative space, evoking the gnawing feeling that you're being watched or stalked or something to that effect. I wasn't sure what I thought about this track when I first heard it, but it's probably the biggest grower in the track listing. The way we go from minimal buildups of bass in the beginning into a quick bridge of haunting guitars into a marginally more pulse-pounding second half that has more creeping melodic textures around the corners, it certainly nails that stalkerish vibe it's all going for. And a lot of the exact same kinds of percussion patterns that track explored are repurposed into the following track, Ora Amora, which twists them around into this marginally more comforting and melancholy kind of mix driven by some slow-moving pianos and a lot of fluttering synth chords around the edges. Feel like I even heard some flutes in the mix there, and again, the Grander string bit at the end is really nice. This is admittedly a track I felt like I wanted to like more than I think I did. It's one of those moments more likely to blend in the background for me, and while the idea going into it is among the more straightforward and focused here, the particular way its core ideas build directly off the surrounding tracks ends up making it feel more like a transitional moment than a standout in its own right. Although after this point, the album starts to pick up even more for me and we start to get more of the properly great moments, including one of my most consistent favorites in the track listing in Underpunished. This is one of the most energetic and propulsive moments on the album, and while some of the mixes of synth arpeggios can vaguely remind me of earlier tracks of his, like Conveyor, he takes those sounds into new places that don't sound quite like any other track I've heard from him. There's like some kinda growling maybe vocoder effects around the edges that feel like they might be taking mild influence from 2010's dubstep, and some incomprehensible chopped up vocal snippets from what sounds like a shouting rapper or something, which I thought were really cool additions. Maybe feels like he might be touching back on some of the influences that he previously only explored on some of his really early work, but presenting them in a completely new way through the lens of his modern style, and yeah, it's a lot of fun. Also, the progressions of synth plex here do make for one of the album's more actually effective melodic hooks, so yeah, very easy major highlight. Next up we got an interlude called Godwake, which I didn't even notice on my first couple of listens, but once I did pick up on what it was doing, I immediately came to appreciate it. It's just about 2.5 minutes of purely ambient string pads slowly building up and swirling around, and the whole thing is one big grand crescendo that comes to feel very impressive and imposing. It may be easily the shortest and most straightforward piece here, but it's another example of how sometimes Willis's simplest compositions can be some of his most striking. Although the next track ends up being a much bigger highlight for almost the exact opposite reasons. Sincerio is another one of the album's more complex and steadily evolving compositions that stands out mostly for having the most positive and uplifting sets of melodies on the album, I guess. Not necessarily saying much given how dark everything else is trying to be, and there is also a lengthy dark ambient intro to this one as well. But once the synth rhythms and percussion, I think in like a 12/8 kind of pattern, start coming in, there's these much brighter sounding piano progressions peeking around the edges, and a little before the 2-minute mark everything cuts out for warm classical pianos, and going from there the track really starts to feel a little maybe John Hopkins-y in the best way. Not a time signature John Hopkins would use, I don't think, but the mix of sounds is kind of similar. The middle portion is all like warm pianos and tactile IDM blends that feel quite chill and comforting, although even more dramatic buzzing bass washes around it, and all of it pays off in a similar fashion to many other tracks here, where all the elements come together, along with some grander string sections to feel like this big, earnest, emotional climax. While this track once again doesn't have much of a hook, the way all of it shifts and builds up and pays off, as well as the way its particular tone contrasts with the rest of the album, make it another easy favorite for me. Next is Vestigio, which is quite cool, delivers another dark and brooding mix of heavy bass, tapping percussion, a few darker choir pads, and other synth riffs around the edges that all add up to a very tense atmosphere. Although I think this is probably the track I would have to mark as my personal least favorite on the album, out of it feeling the most redundant in overall context. There's not really anything I can point to that this track specifically does that other tracks here, especially Diamond Spitter and the Gnawing, don't already do better. It's not a skip, it's still a track I can very much enjoy while it's on in the moment, just not one I'm likely to remember since he's done lots of other stuff that sounds just like it. Now, if I may have seemed somewhat lukewarm on many parts of this album, it is worth noting that this album, regardless of my feelings on those specific moments, was pretty much always going to be cemented in great territory, and I was never considering scoring this album anything lower than a solid 8. Almost entirely on the merit of pretty much one track in particular, and that is the penultimate track, I Am a Forest Fire. Which isn't just the best track on the album by a long shot, but is also one of the very best tracks Willis has ever made, full stop. This entire album may have already been going for lots of dramatic, intense mixes, but this track really elevates everything to a whole different level over a lengthy arrangement stretching on over 10 minutes and not feeling its length at all. First of all, the way Vestigio directly transitions into it is really cool, with a flanging bass at the end of that track kind of slowly speeding up and changing shape into extremely light one-note beeping sequences. But once the track itself gets going, and its 3/3/2 rhythms and beats and deeper piano kick into gear, there's a sense of propulsion and immediate urgency to this track that immediately gets you to sit up and pay attention, even in spite of how subtle the mix starts out. The strings and pianos that start building up around the mix might feel somewhat comforting and welcoming, but also convey this odd sense of dread, like evoking the feeling of like bringing your family together so that you can all evacuate some kind of incoming disaster. And that's before the track starts shifting into something a bit more percussion heavy that reveals this may have low-key been a drum and bass cut at its core the whole time, in the way some much faster paced breakbeats start to come in a little under the surface. And at the height of that section's crescendo around the 4-minute mark, everything completely stops dead and cuts away into near silence, as these very light and subtle spacey synth pad progressions start to build up around it. The mix at this point starts to give me maybe like a little hint of an Aphex Twin rhubarb adjacent kind of vibe. Although the beeping from the beginning, some of the drum and bass beats very slowly start to manifest underneath it, and then some bass and this incomprehensible indie soul singer sample comes in. The vibe being created in this part starts to give me some of like the same feelings as something like Wayward's Waiting for the World in the best way. And over the next minute, everything crescendos even more, the mix gets even more propulsive and expansive and drum and bassy, until finally paying off a little before the 7.5-minute mark, by just making the percussion so heavy and dense and cranking every musical element up to 11. More wailing string pads, more crashing live drumming, and distorted bass. It reaches this absolutely massive climactic height, until finally slipping into the falling action about 8.5 minutes in. Still lots of dense, skittering percussion banging, but the melodies underneath get more subtle. That kind of indie soul singer sample comes back for a bit, and then the last minute lets everything wash away into the emotional ambient pads again. Holy fuck, I have no words for how damn insane and immediately affecting I Am a Forest Fire was. Easy, like, top 5 tracks he's ever made, maybe even top 3. The entire album is worth purchasing for that track alone. And thankfully, he makes sure not to waste a massive climax like that, and he uses the ambience at the end of that track to build into the album's tender emotional finale, An Endless Path Ascending. This is another fully ambient track, although it's another one of the easy biggest highlights on the whole album. This track is mostly built on a foundation of all these aching and fuzzy light noise pads getting abruptly panned between the left and right ears. But the pianos and strings and light choirs that build around it feel so achingly beautiful and equally joyous and sad. Very much hitting on that end of a movie type emotion. And of course this track once again finishes in one last grand string crescendo, and the mix suddenly glitching up and starting to border on feeling like it might fall apart at the seams, disintegration loop style, before quietly fading out at the very end to let a couple of light woodwind notes close everything out. God damn, what an ending to this album. I mean, the first 8 tracks of this album was in the high 7 range for me. Very good, and a couple of great moments, but maybe in other moments feeling too much deja vu. But the very end of this album is squarely in the 9 range. Just absolutely freaking knocked out of the park. And that makes an interesting contrast to Sediment. That was an album I felt started better than it finished. And it's being followed up by an album that ends way better than it starts. Almost like this is part 2 to Sediment's part 1. Reliquary at the end of the day may not be nearly as consistently stunning for me as Sediment was. The melodies on that album were just stronger and more memorable across the board, and the pacing felt markedly tighter in spite of, I think, that album running on longer than this. As a complete whole, I wouldn't necessarily put this among the best work he's ever put out. Maybe kind of lower middle tier for him. Again, that is not saying much since his whole catalog is once again very consistent, and even his weakest albums are still really good. This was the kind of album that left me sort of hungering for a slight bit more of a shake-up to his usual formula, but obviously even if a lot of this album may be familiar territory for him, that cannot take away from the craft on display here regardless. If you've never heard a Reid Willis album at all before, you can just jump into this and get your mind blown by the scale of the kinds of sounds that he does regularly use. And even as someone who has gotten used to his style, I can't deny just how high some of the high points on this thing are. Again, it is worth the purchase for how damn incredible the ending is alone. So yeah, at the end of the day, while I don't envision this album topping my year-end list, it is yet another great effort from Reid Willis that will definitely be worth hearing if you haven't heard it yet, and I think I can just let it off with a light 8.3 out of 10. But of course, this is just my opinion. You can feel free to disagree with it, but I'd like to hear your thoughts, so leave the comments in the comment thing down there. Shout out to my Patreon supporters, they're awesome people. You want to add yourself that list, link to my Patreon is in the description. But yeah, that's pretty much it. That's all for today. See you next time.